The Honourable Mary Ann Street.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it gives me some pleasure to rise after the speech from the former Minister of Housing, as a former Minister of Housing myself. So let's just track through some of the different ideas that exist between the National Party and the Labour Party on housing affordability. First of all, Mr Speaker, however, I do want to say that in the 5 years that this government has been in office, we have seen a stunning lack of activity on housing affordability. The Minister, the member who has just resumed his seat, the previous Minister, has said he came into the portfolio on a slogan about cold, old and mouldy houses, which was just about the only thing he ever saw fit to address in his time. No acknowledgement of the work that had gone on by the previous government in upgrading and insulating state houses, starting with the coldest part of the country first, at the bottom of the South Island, and moving progressively northwards so that we could improve the state of our government's housing stock for those who are most in need. In addition to that, of course, we also brought in a subsidy system for insulation for homes owned in the private sector. And that, of course, is never acknowledged by the former Minister of Housing. And so suddenly to get to this point, 5 years on in this government's tenure, and see a rush of activity on housing affordability tends to make us roll our eyes on this side of the House. Mr Speaker, one of the points is that under the period that the National Government has been in power since the end of 2008, we have seen skyrocketing prices. Prices for housing up 30% in Auckland, up 26.5% in Christchurch. We've seen 1,500 fewer building consents between 2008 and 2012. Mr Speaker, this government has not been attending to the issue of housing affordability. I thought the situation was dire when I was the Minister of Housing in 2007-2008. But in fact, there has been a more precipitous decline in home ownership, particularly in Auckland, in the last few years than was happening at that time. We have seen not only housing ownership levels get worse, but we have seen this huge increase, some 17% on average, I think, Mr Speaker, 17% increase in housing prices over the whole of New Zealand. Worse in Auckland, worse in Christchurch, worse in those less affordable parts of the country. But it has got worse under this government, not better. Mr Speaker, in response to one of the earlier speakers, I'd like to say that Labour would be happy to support this bill if we thought it would make one jot of difference to housing affordability. Nowhere does it talk about housing affordability except with, by implication, in a rushed supplementary order paper that the Minister brought into the House at the last minute earlier this week. So this isn't about a planned, systematic approach to housing affordability. This is a knee-jerk reaction because there's a lot of noise out there about housing affordability. It was bad enough when I was Housing Minister. At least we brought in legislation that made it possible for local authorities to require 10%, not the whole lot, just 10% of any residential development to be put aside for affordable houses. And what did the national government do? On assuming office, almost immediately repealed that legislation, because they have never been concerned about the low to middle income earners who have as much right to get their foot on the first rung of the home ownership ladder as anybody else. And now that it's beginning to squeeze the children of the upper middle class, whom the National Party listens to more than anybody else, now that it's starting to squeeze and impact on their children, now the national government is hearing the noise for the first time. And that's because the prices are so much higher than they were even 5 years ago, Mr. Speaker. In addition to bringing in legislation in our day, we brought in a raft of other measures. The welcome home loans, which in fact this government has kept but cut back the funding to. We introduced the KiwiSaver measures that allowed those who had invested in KiwiSaver, signed up to KiwiSaver, saved a certain amount, $1,000 a year, $1,000 a year for 5 years, that $5,000 would be matched by the government with $5,000. So if a couple could manage to save $5,000 over 5 years, which is achievable even on a low to middle income, it is achievable if one works hard at it, then that would have been a combined amount of $20,000 to go towards a deposit, which in concert with a welcome home loan would have given people the first step up on that ladder of home ownership. But, Mr. Speaker, the shared equity scheme that we introduced was scrapped by the government. They repealed our laws, as they've said. They've opposed the ambition of 100,000 new affordable homes over a 10-year period. They've opposed our proposals for a capital gains tax, which would see a tax on a capital gain made from speculative investment on housing, and that would change the nature of where people might invest in this country. Mr. Speaker, I also want to correct something a previous member said when she railed against xenophobia. I would join her in railing against xenophobia. There is no place for xenophobia in this multicultural society of ours. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that our opposition to foreign buyers is on the basis of those who speculate, not those who want to come and live in New Zealand. It's on the basis of being speculators, not genuine people who are seeking to be citizens and permanent residents of New Zealand. So let's not hear any more nonsense in that respect. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to revert to one of my old themes, and it is about land supply. The previous speaker talked about land supply as being the critical factor. It's only one of the critical factors. Low wages is another critical factor in housing unaffordability. But it seems to me that in the releasing of Crown land for increased density, which is what the Labour government did both in Glen Innes and in Hobsonville, that was the approach that combined all the necessary factors to get things going. The Minister the other day told us that 400 houses had been built in Hobsonville. 400 houses had been built in Hobsonville, and we were meant to applaud him. How many of them were affordable? How many were affordable? 17, Mr. Speaker. 17 were meant to be, or are meant to be, affordable houses. So this government has no interest in genuinely addressing affordable housing. If they were genuinely interested, they would have brought forward a bill that would have achieved that, rather than this nominal piece of nonsense that we have in front of us today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to take a call on the third